The thermometer read -40 degrees Celsius. A Red Army soldier crouched in a foxhole outside Moscow. His boots had disintegrated weeks ago. He had wrapped his feet in strips of cloth torn from a dead man's uniform. The blood from his frostbitten toes soaked through the rags and froze solid before it could drip. This was not one man's nightmare. This was the daily reality for hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers in World War II. How did they survive without boots? How did they fight, march, and win while their feet were literally falling apart? The answer is more brutal and more incredible than you can imagine. The winter of 1941 and 1942 was the coldest in a century. Temperatures across the Russian front plunged to 40 degrees below zero and stayed there for weeks. Wind chill froze exposed skin in under 60 seconds. Metal stuck to flesh. Oil turned to sludge. And yet, in this frozen hell, the Red Army not only survived, it launched a counteroffensive that shattered the German advance and saved Moscow. But behind that victory lies a paradox. The Soviet soldier became legendary for his ability to endure the cold. Propaganda posters showed sturdy men in thick coats marching through snowdrifts to crush the fascist invader. The truth is messier. In the desperate autumn of 1941, millions of Soviet troops were issued leather boots that fell apart within days. Factories had been packed onto trains and moved east, ahead of the German blitzkrieg. Production collapsed. Soldiers fought in whatever they could find: strips of canvas, birch bark, old tires tied to their feet with wire. Amputations due to frostbite filled field hospitals. Some units reported 50% of casualties were from the cold, not enemy fire. This is the story of how men turned their own feet into weapons, of logistics pushed to the brink, of ingenious survival hacks born in trenches, and of the brutal arithmetic that decided who got boots and who got to die. Because what you think you know about the Soviet Winter War is only half the truth. To understand how they survived, we have to go back to the moment everything fell apart. The summer of 1941, when the largest invasion in history caught the Red Army completely unprepared, and the race for survival began before the first snowflake fell. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 in the morning, 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border. It was the largest invasion in the history of warfare. Adolf Hitler called it Operation Barbarossa, and he was so confident of victory that he did not bother to issue his troops a single pair of winter boots. The plan was simple, arrogant, and catastrophic. German high command believed the Red Army would collapse in 6 weeks. They expected Moscow to fall before the autumn leaves turned. They told their soldiers to pack summer uniforms and light coats. The war would be over by Christmas, so why carry the extra weight of wool and fur? But the Soviet Union was not Poland or France. It was a continent unto itself, a vast expanse of forests, swamps, and steppe that stretched 11 time zones from east to west. And its army, though shattered by Stalin's purges of the officer corps, was still the largest standing military force on earth, with over 5 million men under arms. The Germans had underestimated everything: the distance, the resistance, the weather. In those first catastrophic weeks, the Red Army crumbled. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed. Soviet soldiers retreated on foot, abandoning tanks and trucks that ran out of fuel, throwing away rifles just to lighten the load. The roads clogged with refugees, horse-drawn carts, and columns of exhausted men. By the end of September, the Germans had captured over 3 million Soviet prisoners. They held a line from Leningrad in the north to Rostov in the south. Moscow lay 300 kilometers from the front. Victory seemed inevitable. But inside that disaster, a quieter catastrophe was unfolding. The massive retreat consumed supplies faster than they could be replaced. The Red Army lost not just men and territory, but the very infrastructure needed to fight a winter war. Clothing factories in Ukraine and Belarus were overrun before they could evacuate. Warehouses full of boots and coats were captured intact. The soldiers who survived the summer had only the clothes on their backs. And winter was coming. It arrived early that year. In October, the autumn rains turned the Russian countryside into a sea of mud. The Rasputitsa, the season of impassable roads, swallowed German tanks and trucks up to their axles. The advance ground to a halt. For a few precious weeks, the Soviet High Command had a window to reorganize, rearm, and prepare for the next phase. They used it to send every available pair of boots to the front. But the math was brutal. There were simply not enough. By November, the first snow fell. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero within days. The Germans, still in their summer uniforms, discovered that their rifles wouldn't fire because the grease had frozen solid. Their tanks couldn't start because the engines cracked in the cold. They began to suffer frostbite at staggering rates. Reports of frozen limbs and gangrene poured into field hospitals. The Wehrmacht had to make a terrible choice: steal from the dead or freeze. But what about the Soviet soldier? Propaganda would later paint him as a Superman who thrived in the snow. But reality was far more complicated. Yes, the Red Army had a tradition of winter warfare dating back centuries. Siberian divisions, pulled from the Far East, arrived wearing thick felt boots called valenki, quilted Tilograyka jackets, and fur hats. These men were trained to sleep in the snow and walk for days in blizzards. They were a terrifying sight to the frozen German infantry. But they were the exception, not the rule. The majority of Soviet soldiers in front of Moscow that November were not Siberians. They were conscripts pulled from cities and farms, boys and old men thrown into uniforms that didn't fit, handed rifles that jammed, and sent into battle with nothing but strips of cloth wrapped around their feet. The iconic Kirza boots, made of layered tarpaulin, had not yet arrived in sufficient numbers. Soldiers scavenged. They pulled boots off corpses, traded with civilians, and resorted to what they called portyanki, foot wrappings of flannel or cotton that had been standard issue since the Tsarist era. Remarkably, when done correctly, a portyanka could protect the foot better than a poorly fitted sock. But in extreme cold, even the best wrapping froze solid. Men would wake up and find their toes black with frostbite, and still they fought, because the alternative was execution for desertion. And here is the thing that will make your blood run cold. The Soviet High Command knew exactly how many soldiers would lose their feet that winter. They ran the numbers. They accepted the losses because the alternative, surrendering Moscow, was unthinkable. The decision was made to trade flesh for time, to hold the line at any cost, to counterattack in the dead of winter, while the Germans were paralyzed by their own arrogance. The lives of thousands of individual soldiers would be sacrificed so that millions could be saved. But to understand how they pulled it off, you have to understand the secret weapon the Soviets possessed that the Germans completely failed to anticipate. It wasn't the cold. It was the boots. And the boots were not what you think. They were not standard issue military boots. They were not leather. They were not even made in a factory, at first. The most feared winter fighters in the Red Army went into battle wearing something that looked like a lump of gray wool, molded around a foot. The valenki, a felt boot with no sole, no heel, no laces, just a thick, seamless tube of compressed sheep's wool, so dense that a nail couldn't pierce it, so insulating that feet stayed warm at 50 below. It was ancient technology. Russian peasants had worn them for centuries, trudging through snowdrifts to market, sleeping in unheated huts. And now, in the winter of 1941, that peasant footwear became the single most sought-after piece of military equipment on the Eastern Front. German soldiers, shivering in their hobnailed jackboots, learned to recognize valenki tracks in the snow. They knew that whoever left those tracks was not cold. They knew that whoever wore valenki could fight. They began ambushing Soviet patrols not for intelligence, not for weapons, but for boots. A dead Soviet soldier's Valenki were worth more than a rifle. German officers looked the other way as their men stripped the felt boots from corpses. Some even sent reports to Berlin begging for felt boots of their own. But the German war machine, designed for quick victories, had no capacity to produce them. The factories back home were making tank treads and ammunition, not traditional Russian winter wear. The irony was devastating. The supposedly superior Aryan soldiers were fighting to steal the shoes of the people they had come to exterminate. But here is the twist that most histories get wrong. The Red Army did not have enough Valenki either. Not even close. In the chaos of the retreat, production had collapsed. The felt factories in the Western territories were captured. The wool supplies were cut. The skilled workers who knew how to shape and compress the felt were dead or drafted. And the Soviet High Command had to make a calculation that would haunt them forever. Who gets the Valenki, and who gets to freeze? The answer was as cold as the winter itself. Valenki went to the elite, the Siberian divisions that had been secretly transferred from the Far East after intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack. These were the troops that would launch the counteroffensive in December. They got the felt boots, the quilted jackets, the fur hats. They were the tip of the spear. Everyone else, the conscripts, the penal battalions, the hastily mobilized factory workers, got what the state could spare. And in many cases that was nothing at all. So how did the ordinary soldier survive? The answer is something you have probably never heard of, and it will change how you think about resilience entirely. It was called the Portyanka, a simple square of flannel or cotton, about 40 centimeters by 90 centimeters. It looked like a dish rag, but wrapped around the foot in a precise, practiced way, it became a sock, a bandage, and a boot liner all in one. The technique had to be learned. If you wrapped it incorrectly, folds would bunch up, blisters would form, and in the cold, those blisters would freeze and turn gangrenous within hours. But if you wrapped it correctly, the Portyanka absorbed sweat, cushioned the foot, and provided an extra layer of insulation against the frozen leather or tarpaulin of the boot. It was a skill passed from veteran to recruit, often in the dark of a trench with shells falling around them, and in the absence of proper socks, which the Red Army did not issue in significant quantities until later in the war. The Portyanka was the difference between walking and dying. But even Portyanki required cloth, and cloth required supply lines, and supply lines required trucks, which the Soviets had lost by the thousands. So soldiers scavenged. They tore strips from abandoned uniforms, from civilian tablecloths, from parachute silk, from anything that could be wrapped. They boiled the rags in melted snow to kill the lice, then dried them against their own skin. The cycle of reuse was endless and grim. A single Portyanka might be worn for months, stiff with dried sweat and blood, until it literally disintegrated. And when it did, the soldier faced a terrifying choice. Take one from a dead comrade, or go barefoot into the snow. But there was another element to this survival equation, one that the Soviet Union has rarely been credited for. Even as the frontline troops were wrapping their feet in rags, something extraordinary was happening hundreds of miles behind them. The greatest industrial migration in human history. In the summer and autumn of 1941, as the Wehrmacht advanced, Stalin issued an order that seemed impossible. Entire factories were to be dismantled, loaded onto trains, and transported east of the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombers. Over 1,500 industrial plants were moved. Workers and their families were packed into freight cars alongside the machinery. They traveled for weeks, sometimes without food, to destinations that were little more than frozen fields. And there, in the middle of nowhere, they rebuilt the factories. They poured concrete in temperatures that cracked skin. They installed forges without roofs overhead. They worked 18-hour days, not because they were forced to, but because they knew what was at stake. Their husbands, sons, and fathers were at the front, and without boots, they would die. One of those relocated factories was the Skorokhod shoe plant from Leningrad. Before the war, it produced civilian footwear. By November of 1941, it was producing Vilenki and Kirza boots in a half-built shed east of the Urals, with women and teenagers operating the machines. The Kirza boot was an innovation born of desperation. Leather was scarce. The Soviet Union had lost access to the cattle herds of Ukraine. So, engineers developed a synthetic material made from layers of cotton fabric impregnated with a rubber-like compound called nogget. It looked like leather, felt like tarpaulin, and repelled water. It was not warm on its own. That's where the Vilenki or Portyanki came in, but it held together under the worst conditions. A pair of Kirza boots could last a year of constant wear. By 1942, the relocated factories were churning out millions of pairs. The soldiers who survived the first winter would never again have to face the cold barefoot. But the first winter was the filter, the great sifting. And the numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. German frostbite casualties in the winter of 1941 to 1942 exceeded 100,000. Some estimates put it closer to 250,000 when you count the men who died from secondary infections, pneumonia, or simple exposure. The German supply system had collapsed so completely that soldiers were stuffing newspapers into their uniforms for insulation. They burned precious fuel to heat stones that they placed in their boots. They huddled in groups, sharing body heat, only to wake up and find the man on the outside frozen solid. The suffering was not just physical. It was psychological. The German soldier had been promised a swift, glorious victory. Instead, he found himself in a frozen wasteland, fighting not just Russians, but the planet itself. The cold did not discriminate. It killed the brave and the cowardly alike. And yet the Soviet soldier suffered too. The myth that Russians are immune to cold is a myth. They froze just as easily. The difference was preparedness, not biology. The Soviet High Command, for all its brutality, understood winter in a way the Germans never could. They had institutional memory. Napoleon's Grand Army had been destroyed by the Russian winter in 1812. The lessons were taught in military academies. Supply depots were stocked with winter gear in advance. The relocation of industry was not improvisation. It was a plan executed with ruthless efficiency. And the soldiers themselves, many of them from rural backgrounds, had grown up knowing that winter could kill. They knew how to build shelters from snow. They knew how to ration food. They knew how to wrap their feet. But knowing and having are two different things. By December of 1941, the Red Army around Moscow was still desperately short of everything. The counteroffensive was scheduled for the 5th of December. The generals knew that if they waited any longer, the Germans might regroup. The window was closing, so they attacked with what they had. Some men had Vilenki, some had Kirza boots, some had only rags. All of them had frostbite waiting. On the eve of that counteroffensive, a young lieutenant named Ivan Vasilievich wrote a letter to his wife. It was never delivered. He was killed the next day. But the letter survived, and in it, he described the state of his unit. He said that of the 60 men under his command, only 11 had boots that did not have holes in them. The rest had wrapped their feet in strips torn from a dead horse's blanket. He said that when they marched, they left bloody footprints in the snow. He said that he had ordered his men to switch boots with the dead, that they should not walk past a corpse without checking its feet. He said that he had seen a man weep, not from fear of battle, but because his feet were so cold he could no longer feel them, and he knew what that meant. He said that they would fight anyway, and they did. The counteroffensive of December 1941 broke the German line. It pushed them back over 100 kilometers from Moscow. It was the first major defeat of the Wehrmacht in the Second World War, and it was won by men whose feet were wrapped in rags. That paradox, The image of the triumphant Russian soldier in felt boots versus the reality of the shivering conscript with frozen toes has been blurred by decades of propaganda and myth-making. The Soviet state, after the war, suppressed stories of equipment shortages. They wanted the world to see the Red Army as an unstoppable force, perfectly supplied, perfectly equipped. The heroes in the films wore crisp uniforms and gleaming boots. The reality was buried in archives and veterans' private memories. But the deeper you dig, the stranger the story gets. Because there is one more element that almost no one talks about. A secret that was not declassified until decades after the war. An external force that arguably saved more Soviet feet than any factory relocation or traditional craft. Lend-Lease. The American program that sent billions of dollars of supplies to the Soviet Union. Among the tanks, aircraft, and ammunition were 13 million pairs of leather boots. American companies tooled for mass production, shipped boots to the Soviet Union via the Arctic convoys, through U-boat-infested waters, past the frozen ports of Murmansk and Archangel. The boots arrived in crates marked with English letters that Soviet quartermasters couldn't read. But they learned quickly. They opened the crates and found that the American boots were double-stitched, insulated, and built to last. Soviet soldiers who had never worn new boots in their lives suddenly had footwear that didn't hurt. The psychological impact was enormous. A man who can walk is a man who can fight. The Lend-Lease boots freed up Soviet factories to focus on weapons and ammunition. They bridged the gap until domestic production could catch up. And they were, in a very real sense, the difference between victory and collapse in the middle years of the war. But this is not the version of history that was taught. The Soviet Union downplayed Lend-Lease for decades, insisting that their victory was entirely self-made. The West, for its part, was happy to take credit where it could. But the soldiers in the snow knew the truth. They called the American boots Second Life. Because that's exactly what they were. So the narrative that the Soviet soldier survived on rags alone is wrong, but not in the way you might expect. It's wrong because it erases the incredible effort, industrial, logistical, and individual, that went into keeping those soldiers clothed. It's wrong because it simplifies a crisis that was far more complex and far more human. The boots on the ground were a patchwork. Traditional Valenki alongside American imports, homemade Portianki layered over factory-made socks, tarpaulin kurzas worn with stolen German wool liners. Every pair of feet was a different story, and each story was a testament to the same brutal truth. The Eastern Front was a war of materials as much as men. The side that got its boots right would win. But we haven't yet talked about the most haunting part of this entire saga. The moment when the logistics failed completely. The point where no amount of innovation could save a man from the cold. The second winter of the war, when the fighting moved to Stalingrad, and the temperature dropped so low that even Valenki weren't enough. A place where soldiers on both sides faced a new kind of horror, and the act of putting on a boot became a surgical procedure. That story, and the choice that thousands of men had to make between their feet and their lives, is where we are heading next. The city of Stalingrad was not a city anymore. By November of 1942, it was a graveyard of shattered concrete and twisted steel, a maze of ruins where every stairwell held a sniper and every cellar hid a platoon of starving men. The Volga River, at the city's edge, was frozen solid, its ice thick enough to drive trucks across. Temperatures hovered at 30 below during the day and plunged past 40 at night. And in the frozen cellars and factory ruins, the war on feet entered its most brutal chapter. It was here that the Soviet soldier learned a new word for an old horror, trench foot. It wasn't new to warfare. Doctors had seen it in the First World War, in the muddy trenches of France. But in Stalingrad, the combination of cold, damp, and constant use pushed the condition to a terrifying extreme. Soldiers would spend days crouched in flooded basements, their feet constantly wet from melted snow and burst pipes. The Kirza boots that had been a lifesaver near Moscow became a trap in Stalingrad. They kept water in as effectively as they kept cold out. A man could stand in a stagnant puddle for hours, feeling nothing. And then when he finally removed his boots, he would find his feet transformed into something unrecognizable. The skin turns white first, then mottled blue, then black. Numbness gives way to a crushing pain as circulation returns, and with it, the onset of necrosis. Dead tissue releases toxins into the bloodstream. The smell of gangrene, sweet and nauseating, fills field hospitals. And the doctors in Stalingrad faced the same brutal arithmetic that the commanders faced at Moscow. Save the foot or save the man. With no antibiotics, no sterile operating rooms, and a constant stream of wounded, amputation was often the only option. Surgeons worked with carpenter's saws. They tied off arteries with sewing thread. They gave the patients a stick to bite, or a few shots of vodka, and then they removed the leg below the knee, above the knee, wherever the rot had spread. The pile of discarded boots outside the field hospital grew faster than the pile of bodies, and the soldiers inside, now stumps healing under filthy bandages, knew they were the lucky ones. They would go home. The dead feet in the snow belonged to men who would never leave Stalingrad. But here is where the narrative takes an even darker turn, because the Germans trapped inside the Stalingrad pocket were suffering worse, much worse. In November 1942, the Soviet Operation Uranus encircled the German Sixth Army, 300,000 men cut off from their supply lines. The German generals promised an airlift, but the planes that made it through brought ammunition and food, rarely winter clothing. The Luftwaffe had calculated that boots and coats were too bulky, too low priority. Soldiers fought in the same summer uniforms they had worn the year before. The lucky ones had looted Soviet Vilenki earlier in the campaign. The unlucky ones stuffed their boots with straw, with newspaper, with the fur of dead cats. But cats had all been eaten by December. So had rats. So had horses. The desperation inside the pocket spiraled into a horror that defies comprehension. Men were executed for stealing a single shoe from a comrade. The ground was frozen too hard to bury the dead, so bodies were stacked like cordwood, and the living scavenged boots from the frozen feet. But pulling a boot off a corpse, in 40 below cold, is not a simple act. The leather adheres to the frozen skin. You cannot simply pull. You have to cut. If you are careful, you might salvage the boot. If you are not, you tear the foot off with it. And this was done daily, as casually as opening a can of rations. Because a pair of boots was the difference between walking to the latrine and collapsing in the snow, never to rise. A captured German officer later wrote that the great struggle of Stalingrad was not between nations, but between men and their own feet. He described a morning where he counted 17 soldiers in his battalion who had taken off their boots the night before and could not put them back on. Overnight, their toes had frozen into grotesque clumps. The skins split open like overripe fruit. They could not walk, let alone fight. They sat in a row against a wall, waiting for the end. He said that the only mercy was that after a certain point, the pain stopped. The numbness returned, creeping up the legs like rising water. And then the body surrendered, and the men slipped into a sleep from which they did not wake. This was the reality of winter on the Eastern Front, and it raises a question that historians still argue about. If both sides froze, if both sides starved, if both sides suffered unimaginable losses of limbs and life, what made the difference? Why did one side ultimately break, while the other held? The answer returns, again and again, to something buried in the logistics of supply and the psychology of endurance. It returns to the boots and the feet inside them. The Soviet soldier, for all the horrors he endured, was part of a system that had adapted to winter warfare on a civilizational scale. The relocation of industry was only part of it. The other part was cultural. The Soviet Union was a land of snow and ice for half the year. Every citizen from the age of 5 learned how to wrap a portyanka. It was taught in schools, demonstrated in factories, perfected through a lifetime of practice. The wrapping technique was a ritual passed down through generations. First, you lay the cloth flat on your palm. Then you place your foot diagonally across it, leaving a flap to tuck over the toes. Then you wrap the sides around the arch, once, twice, pulling just tight enough to eliminate wrinkles. Then you fold the remaining fabric over the ankle and tuck it in. A properly applied portyanka is seamless inside the boot. It does not slip. It does not bunch. It wicks moisture away from the skin. It can be reversed and worn a second day, a third, a fourth, until it is too stiff to bend. The German soldier had no equivalent. He had socks, thin, cotton socks that absorbed moisture, frosted over and shredded. When he tried to imitate the Soviet portyanka, he lacked the skill. He wrapped too tight and cut off circulation. He wrapped too loose and got blisters. The knowledge gap was as fatal as the equipment gap, but it gets even bigger. Because the Soviet war effort was not just about production or tradition. It was about the mobilization of an entire society around the single goal of keeping a soldier's feet alive. While the men fought at the front, women and children in the rear engaged in what can only be described as a vast, distributed cottage industry of survival. Every village had a collective farm, and every collective farm had a quota of wool to be processed into Valenki felt. Old women spent their days carding wool by hand. Teenage girls learned the craft of felting, which involves soaking wool in hot water and soap, and then beating it with sticks until it compresses into a dense, solid mass. The process is brutal on the hands. The water must be scalding to open the wool fibers. The beating must be constant for hours. A single pair of Valenki could take a week of labor from start to finish. But the result was worth more than gold. Each pair was sent to the front with a note tucked inside. For our defenders, come home alive. The state also organized massive collection drives. Civilians were asked to donate warm clothing. Schools competed for the highest contributions. Children knitted mittens. Workers contributed a day's wages to buy materials. By the winter of 1942, over 5 million pairs of Valenki had been produced and distributed. The numbers are staggering, but they still fell short. The Red Army numbered over 6 million men, so the math of survival persisted. Not everyone got Valenki. Not everyone got American boots. Many still relied on portyanki and hope. But the crucial difference between 1941 and 1942 was that the shortages were now managed with experience. Quartermasters knew which units were headed for the coldest sectors. They prioritized the shock troops, the guards divisions, the ski battalions. The rest received whatever was left. It was a form of triage, cold-blooded and efficient, and the soldiers who drew the short straw understood the logic, even if they hated it. They had seen what happened when the Germans ran out of time. They were not going to run out of time themselves. Yet there is a deeper layer to this story that rarely gets told, because it complicates the heroic narrative. The Soviet soldier did not just survive the cold through grit and government supply. He survived because he learned to become a scavenger on a scale that modern armies can scarcely imagine. The battlefield was a resource. Every dead German was a supply depot. Their uniforms were stripped within minutes. Their boots, so inadequate for winter, were still raw material. Leather could be cut and reshaped into patches for Soviet boots. The hobnails could be pried out and sold for food. The felt from German caps could be layered into foot wraps. Soldiers who were caught stealing from their own supply dumps were shot, but stripping the enemy dead was encouraged. The army even organized official collecting squads after major battles. They would move through the frozen corpses, pulling off anything usable: belts, pouches, helmets, and always Always boots. The bodies were left barefoot in the snow. There was no dignity in it. There was no choice. But the scavenging went beyond the battlefield. In the occupied territories, Soviet partisans developed their own supply networks, often built around footwear. They raided German warehouses. They traded with villagers for homemade valenki. They ambushed patrols specifically to capture boots. A famous partisan leader, Sadir Kovpak, once noted in his diary that his unit had more rifles than boots, and that a bootless man was a liability. He ordered his scouts to report not just enemy positions, but enemy footwear. A German officer's riding boots were a prize worth risking a life for. This macabre economy of footwear extended even to the cities. In Leningrad, under siege for 900 days, the civilian population faced a winter that made Stalingrad seem mild. Temperatures dropped to 40 below. There was no heat, no electricity, no running water. People burned books, furniture, and finally the floorboards of their own apartments. And yet, in that frozen hell, people did not burn their boots. Because boots were mobility. Boots meant you could walk to the Neva River to collect water. Boots meant you could stand in line for bread. Without boots, you were trapped in your apartment, waiting for death. The siege diaries of Leningrad are filled with accounts of people trading their last possessions for a pair of shoes, a wedding ring for a patched Valinok, a silver tea set for boots with soles, and the most haunting detail: when people died in their apartments, the neighbors would come, not for the body, but for the boots. Starvation had reduced human instinct to its barest arithmetic. The dead do not walk. The living need what they left behind. The same calculus played out in the prisoner of war camps, where Soviet captives faced a death rate of over 50%. German guards withheld winter clothing as a form of deliberate extermination. Men stood in open pens in their summer rags, their feet bound in cement sacks, and froze to death by the thousands every night. The few who survived did so by forming mutual protection pacts, sharing body heat and foot wraps, and finding ways to steal straw for insulation. Some went mad, others went numb. The ones who made it out were never the same. But here is the revelation that turns everything on its head. After the war, historians and military analysts studied the winter campaign on the Eastern Front, looking for the secret to Soviet victory. They expected to find some brilliant tactical innovation, some weapon system that had turned the tide. What they found instead was a mundane, almost invisible advantage. The Soviet soldier fought with his feet on the ground, in boots that worked. The boots were not high-tech. They were not even consistent in quality. But they existed, in sufficient numbers, by the time it mattered most. The Germans, for all their engineering prowess, did not manage to provide the same basic necessity. And that failure was not just logistical, it was philosophical. The German war plan had been built on arrogance, on the assumption that the enemy would collapse before winter arrived. When winter arrived, anyway, the German soldier was already beaten. His feet told him so before his officers did. The Soviet command, for all its brutality, never made that mistake. They had learned from Napoleon. They had learned from the Civil War. They knew that winter in Russia is not a season, it is an active participant in the fighting, an ally to one side and a death sentence to the other, depending entirely on preparation. And so the preparation became an obsession. The factories east of the Urals ran 24 hours a day. The American convoys braved the Arctic Ocean, losing one ship out of every 3, to deliver boots that would be worn within days of arrival. The old women in the villages beat wool until their hands bled. The whole structure of the Soviet state, from the general secretary down to the last collective farm worker, bent toward the single task of keeping soldiers' feet from freezing. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling part of this entire story. The Soviet Union was a regime that committed unspeakable crimes against its own people. It executed suspected deserters by firing squad. It sent political prisoners to fight in penal battalions where the life expectancy was measured in weeks. It starved millions in the name of collectivization. And yet, when it came to the practical business of fighting a war, it understood something that its enemies did not. A dead soldier cannot fight. A soldier who cannot walk cannot fight. A soldier who knows that his government will at least try to keep him alive through the winter is a soldier who will wake up at dawn, wrap his portianka with numb fingers, pull on his valenki, or his kirza, or his American leather boots, and march into the guns. The boots were not a symbol of victory. They were the precondition of victory. Without them, the counteroffensive at Moscow fails. Without them, Stalingrad becomes a mutual annihilation rather than a turning point. Without them, the Red Army does not reach Berlin in 1945. And the world today would be unrecognizable. But before we get to Berlin, before we see the final triumph of those battered, frost-bitten feet, there is one more chapter. The forgotten sequel. The aftermath of the Winter War, when the survivors came home and faced a new kind of struggle. The men who had lost their feet in the snow. The veterans who would never walk unaided again. The families who had sacrificed everything. And the quiet, decades-long reckoning that the Soviet Union tried to suppress. Because the story of how Soviet soldiers survived without boots does not end with the last gunshot. It ends with the question of what surviving actually cost. And that is a story no propaganda poster ever told. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the Red Army had marched from Stalingrad to Berlin. The soldiers who made that march looked nothing like the desperate conscripts of 1941. They were battle-hardened, well-equipped, and riding American trucks while wearing American boots. But the scars of the earlier winters were written on their bodies. Tens of thousands of men returned home with stumps where their feet had been. Tens of thousands more had all their toes but could no longer feel them. Their feet were permanently numb, white and waxy in the summer heat, prone to ulcers that never healed. The cold had burrowed deep into their bones and taken up permanent residence. The Soviet state had a name for these men: invalidi. Invalids, a bureaucratic category that lumped together amputees, frostbite survivors, and the psychologically shattered. The government promised them care, pensions, medical treatment, special housing, and on paper, those promises existed. In reality, the state that had moved mountains to keep their feet warm during the war now turned its back. The amputees were given crude prosthetic limbs made of wood and leather, often poorly fitted, which caused sores that became infected. They were given small apartments in the basements of buildings, far from the eyes of the public. They were expected to disappear, because the image of the victorious Red Army soldier did not include a man hobbling on crutches, begging on street corners. A veteran named Alexei Petrovich Kuznetsov kept a diary after the war. He had lost both feet at Stalingrad, frostbitten beyond saving, amputated in a field hospital by a surgeon who had been awake for 36 hours. In his diary, he wrote that the worst part was not the physical pain. It was the invisibility. People on the street would look away when they saw him. His own wife, who had waited for him through the siege, could not bear to see the stumps when he removed his prosthetics at night. She asked him to sleep in the other room. He wrote, "I gave my feet for the motherland, and the motherland gave me a corner to hide in." That quiet, private suffering was the shadow side of victory, and it was deliberately erased from the official narrative. You will not find it in Soviet war films. You will not find it in the heroic statues that dot the cities of Russia and Ukraine. The soldier of the memorial complex is always whole and strong, his boots laced tight, his step firm. The reality of the war's cost was too messy for the myth. The myth required heroes, not cripples. But the veterans remembered, and in the years after Stalin's death, they began to speak. Not publicly at first. The old fear still ran deep, but to each other, in the kitchens of their cramped apartments, over vodka and black bread. They told stories that had been forbidden. Stories of officers who shot men for stealing boots from the supply depot. Stories of soldiers who voluntarily walked into minefields because they knew their frozen feet would never heal, and death was faster. Stories of the constant, gnawing anxiety that every man felt. Not about enemy bullets, but about the sky. The sky at dawn determined the fate of their feet. If the sky was clear, the temperature would plummet overnight, and men would wake to find their portianchi frozen to their ankles. If the sky was cloudy, there was hope. The veterans called it the weather of our lives. Every morning they checked the sky before they checked their rifles. One story, told by a veteran named Mikhail Sergeyevich Volkov, has survived in an oral history archive. He described the winter of 1943, when his unit was holding a position in the Ukraine. The temperature had dropped to 35 below. His platoon sergeant, a man named Oleg, gathered the men together and gave them an order that was not in any military manual. He told them to sleep in pairs, with their bare feet pressed against the stomach of their partner, and then to switch halfway through the night. Body heat would keep the feet alive. It was awkward, uncomfortable, and deeply intimate. Men who would never have touched another man otherwise spent every night in an embrace of survival. Those who slept alone froze. Those who shared survived. And Oleg, the sergeant who gave that order, made sure every man in his platoon had a partner. He himself slept with the youngest soldier, a boy of 18 who had been conscripted from a village near Kiev. That boy survived the war, and 60 years later, when Volkov told the story, he wept. He said that Oleg had given him the warmth of his own body, and that he had never been able to thank him, because Oleg was killed by a mortar shell 2 weeks later. These stories reveal a truth that goes beyond logistics and industrial production. The Soviet soldier survived not just because of Velenki and Portianki, not just because of relocated factories and American boots. He survived because of the bonds between men. The mutual dependence that the cold forced upon them created a solidarity that transcended ideology. They were not fighting for Stalin or for communism. They were fighting for each other. For the man whose feet were pressed against their stomach in the dark, for the sergeant who made sure no one slept alone. The cold stripped away politics and left only the raw, animal need to keep the person next to you alive. And that brings us to the final, most astonishing statistic of this entire story. After the war, the Soviet military conducted a comprehensive study of frostbite casualties. The researchers interviewed thousands of survivors and reviewed medical records from every major winter campaign. They wanted to know what factors correlated with survival. They expected the answer to be about equipment, the quality of boots, the availability of portianki, the insulation of uniforms. But the data showed something different. The single strongest predictor of whether a soldier survived severe frostbite was not his equipment, it was whether he had a close friend in his unit. A comrade who would check his feet at night, who would notice if he was limping, who would share a blanket or a pair of socks. The presence of another person who cared was more protective than the best pair of Velenki ever made. This finding was buried. The Soviet military did not want to publish a study that suggested human bonds were more important than state-supplied equipment. It ran counter to the entire propaganda apparatus, which emphasized the power of Soviet industry and the wisdom of the party. So the study was classified and forgotten. It sat in an archive for 50 years, untouched, until a historian stumbled across it in the late 1990s. And when it was finally published, it confirmed what every veteran already knew in his bones. The war was not won by boots. It was won by the men inside them, and by the men who made sure those men did not die alone. Now, fast forward to today. The Velenki is still made in Russia. It is no longer military equipment but a cultural artifact, sold in souvenir shops alongside Matryoshka dolls and lacquered boxes. The Kirza boot, That miracle of tarpaulin engineering is still worn by some Russian soldiers, though it has been largely replaced by modern combat boots. The Portyanka remained part of the standard kit of the Russian army until 2007, when the Ministry of Defense finally announced that socks would replace foot wraps. The decision was met with unexpected resistance. Veterans wrote letters of protest. They argued that a properly wrapped Portyanka was superior to any sock, that young soldiers would never learn the skill, that the old ways were being discarded. It was the last gasp of a tradition that had saved millions of lives. The foot wrap had outlived the Soviet Union itself, and when it was finally retired, a small piece of the war died with it. But the true legacy of the Soviet winter soldier is not found in museums or surplus stores. It is found in the shape of the modern Russian military psyche. The Russian army today still trains extensively for winter operations. They still produce specialized cold weather gear that is among the best in the world. They still view winter as a strategic asset, something to be used rather than endured. The institutional memory of 1941 runs deep. No Russian commander would ever repeat the German mistake of invading without winter clothing. That lesson is encoded in their DNA. And for the rest of us, the story of the Soviet soldier's feet offers something more than military history. It offers a meditation on what human beings are capable of enduring. When we look at photographs of those men, with their hollow cheeks and their patched uniforms and their wrapped feet, we see suffering that is almost incomprehensible. But we also see something else. We see resilience that is almost incomprehensible. We see that the line between life and death, between walking and collapsing, between victory and defeat, was often no thicker than a strip of flannel cloth wrapped around a frozen foot. The soldier from our opening scene, the one crouched in a foxhole near Moscow with blood freezing through his rags, was a real person. His name was Sergei. He was 22 years old. He survived that night and the night after and the night after that. He survived the whole war. He lost 3 toes on his left foot and all the toes on his right. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He never talked about the war to his children. But every winter, when the first snow fell, he would sit by the window and look at his feet. His daughter, now an old woman herself, remembers asking him once what he was thinking. He said, "I am thinking about my boots." She did not understand. She had never heard of Portyanki or Valenki or the frozen corpses in Stalingrad. To her, boots were just boots. But to him, they were the difference between the grave and the life she was now living. And that, in the end, is the whole story. Not how the Soviet soldier survived without boots, but how he survived anyway, and what that survival cost, and what it meant for the world that came after. Now, if you want to understand how the Allies won the war with logistics of their own, how the American supply chain became the true secret weapon, stay with me. That story is next. The logistics of war are often told through the lens of machines. The factories that churned out tanks, the ships that crossed the ocean, the railways that fed the front. But the story of the Soviet soldier's feet is a reminder that logistics is also profoundly personal. Every pair of boots had a history. Every strip of cloth wrapped around a foot held a memory of the hands that had spun the wool, the villagers who had collected it, the quartermaster who had decided who was worthy of receiving it, and the comrade who had torn it from a body in the snow. The Eastern Front was a vast system of supply and demand, but it was also a mosaic of individual acts of care, sacrifice, and desperation. When we think about the Second World War, we tend to focus on the grand turning points: D-Day, Midway, Kursk. We remember the generals and the weapons. But the soldiers who actually fought those battles were thinking about their feet. A tank commander, checking his fuel gauge, was also checking his socks. A pilot climbing into his cockpit had first wrapped his ankles in silk scavenged from a parachute. A rifleman charging a machine gun nest was acutely aware of every stone and frozen rut under his boots. The physical experience of war, the actual sensation of being in a body that is cold, wet, and exhausted is often missing from the history books. And yet that experience, multiplied across millions of men, determined outcomes as surely as any strategic decision. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million people in the war. It is a number so large that it loses meaning. But within that number are millions of individual stories of frostbitten feet, of amputations, of infections that killed slowly in filthy field hospitals. And there are also millions of stories of survival, of the strange resilience that comes from knowing that someone somewhere has fought to keep you alive. The woman in the Urals who worked a 16-hour shift to produce a single pair of Valenki. The American sailor who sailed through Arctic storms to deliver a crate of boots. The sergeant who forced his men to sleep in pairs. All of them, in their own way, were part of the same supply chain. A chain that stretched from the factories of Detroit to the frozen cellars of Stalingrad, from the felt-beating sheds of Kazakhstan to the foxholes outside Moscow. This perspective changes how we understand not just the war, but survival itself. We live in a world that still believes in the myth of the solitary hero, the person who overcomes through sheer individual will. But the evidence from the Eastern Front points in the opposite direction. Survival was collective. The men who made it were not necessarily the strongest or the most resourceful. They were the ones who were connected to others, who could rely on a network of care. The cold did not respect bravery. It killed indiscriminately, but it killed less often among those who had someone to check their feet at night. That is a truth that extends far beyond the frozen hell of 1941. It is a truth about what it means to be human. The veteran Sergei, the one who lost his toes and sat by the window every winter, once told his grandson that the war had taught him one thing. He said, "The only real warmth in this world comes from other people. Everything else is just a temporary barrier against the cold." He said that his Valenki had been good boots, but they were nothing compared to the friend who had taken them off a dead German and carried them for 3 kilometers through a blizzard to deliver them to him. The boots were just wool and felt. The act of carrying them was love. And love, in the end, was the only supply that never ran out. Now, if that story resonates with you, then you are the kind of viewer who understands that history is not just dates and battles. It is the accumulated weight of human experience. And we have more stories like this one. Stories about the forgotten logistics of war, the hidden turning points, the human details that change everything. So, before you leave, do 2 things. First, hit subscribe. This channel is dedicated to bringing you long-form documentaries that treat history not as a collection of facts, but as a living, breathing narrative. When you subscribe, you are telling the algorithm that you want more stories like this, and you are helping us to keep making them. Second, click the video on your screen right now. It picks up where this one left off, diving into the American supply chain that became the true secret weapon of the Allies. Trust me, you will never look at a shipping container the same way again. Thank you for spending your time with me. I'll see you in the next one.